Reconstruction Realities. And I call it Reconstruction Realities because we need to examine what are the realities that really happened during Reconstruction. Not what was believed to happen, not what was promised, but what actually was the result of Reconstruction. So let's take a look at the beginnings of Reconstruction. 1862, President Lincoln and Congress are discussing what are we going to do with the South once the war is over. And there are two plans that come forward. One is Lincoln's plan. Lincoln believes that the South should be pardoned, and there should be general amnesty granted to most citizens, and that once states have 10% of their citizenry males swear allegiance back to the Union, then the state should be brought back into the Union as an official state. The Wade-Davis bill, on the other hand, was arguing that a majority of the state needed to swear allegiance before they could bring their state back to the Union. And the argument is that if 10% of the citizens swear allegiance, the state is not really back in the Union. Most people are not really in support of this move. By the time you get to the end of the war, Lincoln's assassinated, and Andrew Johnson steps in as president. Now, Johnson is not like Congress. Johnson was a member of Congress, but he's a war Democrat. He's not a radical Republican, so he has no necessary allegiance to these radical Republicans who were controlling Congress at the time. He believes, similar to Lincoln, but even a little more so, that the South should be forgiven. Because if the South is engaged in this very radical Reconstruction in which they're punished, they're going to be angrier and it's going to be harder to bring them back into the Union. So Johnson's first plan is to bring back states and allow ex-Confederates to take over the governments. Now the problem with putting ex-Confederates back in power is although there's the 13th Amendment, which guarantees that slavery is invalid, these ex-Confederates are still going to want to return to an older system, the way it was before the war. So they allow for things like black codes to be created, which are unequal injustice to blacks living in the South, where they didn't have to be treated equally to the whites. Because we don't have the 14th and 15th Amendment yet. It's going to come soon, where there's going to be somewhat legal equality based on race. So between about 1865 and 1867, we have these unbelievably return to the old way of things type states in the South. And these governments are ineffective because they're promoting the same things that we fought against in the Civil War. And the radical Republicans believe that we need to somehow stop these states from instituting their old ways. So the radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, bound together and they release in 1867 the Reconstruction Act. And under this Reconstruction Act, the South is going to be divided into 5 military districts. And these districts are going to be run by Union generals. And within the districts, each of the states are going to be run by Republicans until the state has moved through a process of amnesty and reconciliation where it can be brought back into the Union. For instance, by 1870, Virginia is very quickly back into the Union. Other states like Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, they take about 7 or 8 years, and it's not until 1877 that they're brought into the Union. So for this period of time, which is known as Radical Reconstruction, a lot of problems happened in the South. Let's take what the promises were to freed blacks. So in 1865, there's the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is supposed to be an organization that takes care of newly freed slaves to give them some sort of prospect in order for success. Now, yes, the Freedmen's Bureau did provide for some support, especially in South Carolina where grants were made with land, and created organizations such as the Tuskegee Institute and the Fisk Institute, which provided for vocational training for the newly freed blacks. However, the major issue that the Freedmen's Bureau had was it was not ever properly funded, it was not ever properly administrated, it was very corrupt, and money that they did receive did not go to the right sources. So in essence, what happened was the Freedmen's Bureau did not provide what it had promised to freed blacks. It did not give them a better chance for success in this new freed world. Secondly, prior to the end of the Civil War, there had always been a discussion for giving freed slaves land. Because without land, how can you move on? How can you become successful if you don't have land? Land is really what the money of the South was. So the belief was that white plantations would be subdivided and given to blacks at the end of the war. The problem is that not only Democrats were against this, but even radical Republicans, they felt they can't really justify taking private property from white families and subdividing them and giving them now to blacks. So as a result of that, blacks were not really given land that they were promised. And in order to survive without money, without land, they had to reduce themselves to sharecropping. And how sharecropping would work is that, let's say you were a freed slave. You would live on the land of a landlord, form a plantation. And since you had no money, you would pay that landlord your rent in crops that you grew on your land. Except in order to grow those crops, in order to set up your farm, you needed money, which you didn't have. So you took a loan out. And the only people that would give you loans were wealthy businessmen. Typically, on that type of rural situation, the wealthy businessmen were shopkeepers. So you'd go to a shopkeeper, they would give you a loan where they give you stuff to use in order to grow your crops, and hopefully your crops would grow and you'd be able to pay them back. But until you paid them back, they would put a lien on your crops. So technically, you didn't own your crops, you didn't own your land because it was owned by the landlord. So you were living on the land, you owed money to the landlord, you owed crops to the shopkeeper. And if you didn't pay the shopkeeper back, you were basically bound to that shopkeeper forever. So in essence, this land lien system where you were a sharecropper and you couldn't really leave your land because you owed everybody money. In order to pay them back, you had to keep working the land, and you never really could better yourself because you would never end up owning the land and never pay back your debts. This leads to peonage, which is forced labor in order to pay off debts, which is similar to slavery. And it leads to a society of widespread poverty. And not only widespread poverty for blacks, but also widespread poverty for whites. Because the money that could have been invested in improving the farms and the land went into this crazy sharecropping system, which never really made enough money in order to improve the way of life in the South. And while the North was continuing to industrialize, the South stayed in this very primitive sharecropping society. Whites were sharecroppers as much as blacks were sharecroppers. As a result of this, the South stayed very poor until the 1940s, where there were programs invented like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Works Progress Administration, which tried to improve life in the South. But there was this legacy because of Reconstruction. Another issue with Reconstruction is, so the states were given this power to become back in the Union once they had enough people who were able to pledge allegiance to America. The problem is the people still didn't want blacks to have equal rights. So the issue is that as you forced whites in order to follow these 14th and 15th Amendments of equality, ending poll tax and such, or trying to end poll tax, a lot of the citizens didn't want that. And as a result, you had these rogue organizations like the Ku Klux Klan who were formed to try to go against the Union, try to go against these new plans to wipe the South of its past. So Nathan Bedford Forrest forms the Ku Klux Klan. They start attacking Republicans, these scalawags who are ex-Southerners who are helping in order to help these Republicans get stronger, and the carpetbaggers, the ones coming from the North in order to take advantage of the South during this time. And finally, you have massive economic collapse after the Panic of 1873. In 1873, the J. Cook's Railroad Company, one of the largest companies in America, goes bankrupt and starts this domino effect of terrible economic travesty throughout America. As a result, things start going out of business. Mines start going out of business. A lot of industry in the North goes out of business. A lot of railroads go out of business after Jay's company. And this leads to banks also not being able to make loans. And one of the banks that helped out blacks was the Freedmen's Savings Bank. And when that fails, all these blacks that invest their money in this bank are out of all this money. There's no Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation to back it up like there was after the Great Depression. And you get people arguing for smaller government. You get these new liberal Republicans, which sort of sounds like an oxymoron, who are arguing for small government. They don't want this corruption. This large Republican machine is taking over. You have the Democrats fighting in the South. You have elements of the Republicans who want a different type of Republican in power. So the realities of Reconstruction, it did not provide a long-term support system for free blacks. It did not provide stable governments in the South, because after 1877, when this radical Reconstruction was over, the South went back to the way it used to be. You had Democrats coming back into power, the radical Republican leaders leaving, and the black codes coming back. The Jim Crow laws, the black codes, poll taxes, because things couldn't be enforced. You had the Supreme Court, which was arguing that issues like protecting someone's ability to vote based on race was a state issue, not a federal issue. So you had all of these problems coming because of the way Reconstruction actually turned out. It was not fulfilled the way it should have been. Who's to say that was there a better way in order to do this, and would it have turned out differently had Lincoln survived? But the reality of Reconstruction is that by 1877, you had an impoverished South who was still angry about the war. You had a group of African Americans who were freed who didn't have a future because nothing was ever provided for them. You had massive immigration from the South to the North of blacks to cities like Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, to look for jobs because there weren't any available in the South. And you had this huge economic collapse, which led to a re-examination of big business and big government, saying, is it a good idea for government to be able to regulate everything? Should we go back to small government and let free market rule? So these are really the Reconstruction realities that we need to think about. So the political system collapses because one-party rule completely corrupts society. And this is a lesson for politics. The reason we have multiple parties, in this country we only have two, but the reason we have political systems in place with multiple parties is so that we don't have one-party rule. And when you hear that argument of one-party rule, people look back to the Reconstruction times and say, had we had a balance of power between Democrats and Republicans, and we would have looked for the South to have more input as to how we were going to reconstruct the South, perhaps we wouldn't have had as much corruption, and the system might have worked better for African Americans in the end.